the rest of the hour by the editor of World Affairs Brief, Joel Skousen. And I wanted to get him on to talk about the Ukraine situation. I know we're kind of getting Ukraine fatigue, but the big developments have begun to unfold. Russian troops have gone into the area of eastern Ukraine that's mainly Russian, the Crimea. They got fighter jets scrambled, quote, preparing for battle with enemies. Russia admits troops are moving into Crimea. U.S.-backed neo-Nazi party given key roles in the Ukrainian government. Federal court denies First Amendment in California. Coup government in Kiev demands U.S.-Britain mount military response in the Crimea. Now let's start World War III. TSA detains libertarian blogger after seeing Bitcoin in his bag. Again, Russian Air Force drills Ukraine attack plan for military invasion. This is a big development. Here's another headline. 12 signs that Russia is ready to fight a war over Crimea. I get sick of hearing about it. I'm not siding with Russia either, but George Soros' people, the globalists, are in there trying to destabilize things. Some of the folks in Ukraine have real beefs with the Russian-backed government. They had a Western-backed government in 2004. Joel, some stations join us the next segment, so I need you to repeat whatever you say now, but where do you come down on this? Because I don't like coming down on the side of Russia, but I also don't want to come down on the side of Hillary and the State Department and George Soros. It's this old quandary of both sides are bad. I go to the fact that it looks like the West is starting this, so the initiation of the coup says that the Western invasion is bad. Or what do you think?
Well, actually, you're going to get a whole different view from me because you know, my biggest expertise is understanding what the conspiracy is all about. And there's not just one conspiracy. There is a Russian conspiracy.
No, I know there is. That's what I'm asking you.
That's right. But in fact, everything that we've heard on the alternate media has been wrong. This coup was not a Western coup. This was a phony coup pulled off by the pro-Russian forces themselves to make it look like a collapse and to turn it on its head. In other words, we got to go one level deeper in conspiracy theory to understand this is the same thing that happened in the phony coup to overthrow the Soviet Union. There's never been a coup, Alex, in the world that hasn't been done by a military takeover, except in Russia and now Ukraine. Are we to believe that, suddenly all of the powerful forces of the KGB and the Russian army simply collapsed and let unarmed people take over the government in the Soviet? It didn't happen. It was a staged coup, and it was a fraud. And the same thing happened this weekend in the Ukraine. I mean, it's amazing, Alex. No one in the mainstream or even the alternative media asked these essential questions that I put out in today's World Affairs Brief. Number one, who gave the orders for all the riot police, the Berkut, to melt away and leave their posts so that the totally disarmed opposition could easily take control of the city?
No, I pointed that out last week, but I'm going to give you the floor when we come back. That's why I said this is very confusing for me, because why did the government stand down? I thought that was because of the Western threat. They wanted to look good, but they had to know then that this group would take over. Since when did police let rioters shoot them and not shoot back?
That's right. I mean, this was scripted. I mean, who gave the orders to the pro-Russian party of regions?
All right, well, I want you to start over. We're going to come back. Yeah. I'm going to give you the floor. Joel, that's why I got you on, because I really do respect your view, and 9 times out of 10 it's turned out to be very accurate and very piercing. So we want to get your take on this and then tie it into the larger strategy. But, I mean, was Georgia a staged event as well, or was that different in 2008?
Well, that was different. I'll explain that as well.
Yeah, because that looked like that was really the West trying to test Russia, right?
Yeah, and, well, it was the Israelis that were involved in that as well.
Yes, they were involved.
On behalf of the globalists, trying to instigate, I think, but they really did have to move troops.
All right, well, let's start at Georgia, then when we come back. I intellectually study geopolitics. I study different regions of the world. I like to be informed. I find it to be fun, enlightening, energizing. But the more you learn, the more you know you don't know. And the more you learn that governments do involve themselves in conspiracies, wheels within wheels. It's come out the bin Laden raid was staged, a.k.a. Cy Hirsch, 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner. We told you first. Joel Skousen told you as well. I've had Navy SEALs families on whose sons, before they were killed, blown up in the helicopter, said it was staged. They were going after a bin Laden double. there was no body thrown overboard on the ship. If they lie about all that, 9/11, you name it, they'd lie about anything. And there are different criminal organizations battling for control of the planet. 3 different major power blocks. I agree with the editor-in-chief of worldaffairsbrief.com's analysis, former Marine Corps officer and a naval aviator in Vietnam. And again, World Affairs Brief commentary and insight on a troubled world. You can subscribe there on the site. We sell his big color book that's the best out there, according to all the survivalists I talked to, Strategic Relocation, with the film we made with him exclusively at InfoWarsStore.com. I should add, invaluable information per region, your area on politics, race manipulation, resources, threats, you name it, not just for the U.S., but worldwide. So Strategic Relocation, the book and the film. We also sell his bestseller, The Bible on Home Fortification, The Secure Home, all available at InfoWarsStore.com, but that's a side issue. The reason I wanted to get Joel Skousen on is I don't, as I've said, worship Vladimir Putin. I don't romanticize him. I know it's just a different power block. I don't like George Soros, the State Department, and what they're doing, $5 billion into Ukraine, back in 2004, putting another government in. What's really going on? But we know at the highest levels between EU, Russia, the West, the United States, there's also backdoor deals, weapons transfers. China's been given all our bases, the deep water ports, the Panama Canal, the industry. So there's high-level double crossing going on, and something doesn't feel right about all this. And Joel Skousen brought up the point that it looks like the West is backing a coup. It looks like they're funding neo-Nazis. It looks terrible. You've got so-called protesters being called freedom fighters, shooting police at point blank, not getting in trouble, taking over the presidential palace, no one resist, taking over the airports, beating people up, and now you've got the Russians going into eastern Ukraine. Is this a covert deal like the Warsaw Pact or before that when Hitler split part of Poland with Stalin? Is that getting ready to happen? What's really going on here with all your research, Joel Skousen? What's your take on this?
Well, my take, Alex, is that this is pure and simple a faked coup done by the Russians, not by the West, because they're the only ones. It's only the Russian-backed majority rulers in Ukraine that could have given the orders to the Berkut to go back to the barracks and let the opposition have full reign. I mean, the EU globalists don't have that kind of control there. There's only one person. For example, look at the pro-Russian Party of Regions, who has the vast majority in the Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament. They were voting, in a block to stop any reforms. And all of a sudden, on Saturday, they switch and vote unanimously to oust President Yanukovych. Unanimously. Somebody had to give them the word. I mean, this is like the old Soviet days when you see these pictures of the whole Soviet parliament raising their hand in unison and saying, "I," This only happens when you have absolute party control, when you switch things like that. In other words, Paul Craig Roberts talks about the fact that on Sunday, all of a sudden, the Party of Regions started to claim that they had threats on their lives. People were shooting at them. They had to flee for their lives. There were mass resignations. But remember, that happened after they voted unanimously. Why would the opposition be shooting at them and threatening their lives if they were already complying and voting 100% with the opposition? It just doesn't make sense. I'll tell you what happened. It was the secret services controlled by the Russians that not only threatened President Yanukovych to leave, but also the members of the Party of Regions after they had voted to oust Russia. Why would they do that? Because, remember, you've got to make the Ukraine look like it's in Western hands now and controlled, even though it's not. The entire opposition has been created by the Soviets. They control Yulia Tymoshenko and have for years, but she plays up to the West as if she's pro-Western. But Putin and she have a very, very close relationship. And that wouldn't happen if she was truly anti-Russian. And look at Yanukovych's press conference in Russia today, claiming he left only because his life was threatened, and then he was being shot at in his car all along his exit route as he left the country. I'm sorry, Alex, but that just doesn't wash. There aren't but a handful of old hunting rifles in the hands of the opposition. So it's hardly believable they could set up a running ambush on his escape route that nobody knew where he was going or what the escape route was.
So what's the bigger strategy?
Well, here's the bigger strategy. Remember that, let me just cover one other thing, too. You know, the UK Telegraph says that the Russians admitted that armored units from the Black Sea Fleet base near Sevastopol have entered Crimea in order to protect fleet positions. This is the story that everyone's claiming is Russia's moving troops into the Crimea. This is not true. These are only units that are already at the naval base at Sebastopol, and which is in Crimea. They're not moving into Crimea. They're already there, and they're simply going to other bases to ensure that Russia protects its naval bases. This is not in any way a move by Russian military, and neither are the fighter repositioning. This is all political theater by Putin to make it appear, and the Western media is playing this up as if this is a major thing. So here's the game plan. The Ukrainian opposition, of course, is really opposed to the extreme bureaucracy and evil that remains even during Tymoshenko, when she was prime minister from 2005 to 2010. Nothing changed. This is typical of when you have a phony coup. That is, the communists were still in charge of all the bureaucracy. Everybody was still requiring bribes to get anything done. Nothing changed. There was no freedom change in the Ukraine or anywhere else in the Soviet Union. And so naturally, the people have had enough, and they really, and it tipped the tip of the iceberg when Yanukovych refused to have this trade agreement with the EU. So this was legitimate hatred against Russian domination of Western Ukraine. Now, the problem is this opposition in Ukraine was getting too fervent and legitimately so. Yes, there was some flow of Western support in here, but it was not, as Paul Craig Roberts said, a daily handing out of cash. There was one-time stiftungs or subscription, not subscription, but scholarship money that went to some of the students on the front lines. But I have contacts who were right there on the front lines in Ukraine saying these people are just normal people. They actually, don't have any food. They don't have any money. They're sacrificing because they hate this regime. Most of these protesters were absolutely legitimate. As for the claims that there are neo-Nazis protected and supported by the rest, remember, there are no neo-Nazis anywhere in the world, legitimate neo-Nazis. They're only agent provocateurs built up by governments, and Russia does the same thing. They build up, they pay people to become skinheads and neo-Nazis to give the right wing in the world a bad name. And the Russians play this just like the West, because you see, neo-Nazis give them an excuse to attack anyone who's associated with that view. But there's nobody who in their right mind wants to go and champion something in the name of the Nazis unless they're paid for by governments. So we've got to really see through what's going on there. But let me get to the final point, that is, what's the game plan? The opposition was rising much faster than Russia's remilitarization. Russia isn't anywhere near ready to take on the West. And so here's what they've done in order to prolong the conflict in the Ukraine. They pulled a phony coup so that now it appears that Western Ukraine is in the hands of the globalists, but they're not. They're in the hands of Russian puppets masquerading as pro-EU people like Tymoshenko. You mark my words, she'll be back in power pretty soon. Already the prime minister has been named as one of her former lieutenants, and that shows that her Freedom Party is going to be back in power soon. But now, from now on, you're going to have a constant conflict between the Eastern European Russian base.
Tell you what, stay there. I'm going to come back and break this down. Stay with us. Joel, I want you to get into what happened in Georgia in 2008. I want to get your take on the forces involved in that, because clearly you look at it, that was the West trying to go in and test Russia. But there are a lot of telltale signs that it was staged when the police stood down. The argument was, well, they're doing that to look friendly, but the rest of the government stood down as well. And then I guess the country goes into a permanent destabilization where they can play the literal right and left off, the two different sides of the country, the right from the West and the Russian from the East, and then just use that as a tool of political control. I know Russia, to a certain extent, collaborates with the EU, but is against the Anglo-American, British, U.S. power bloc. Explain the strategy there.
Well, the strategy is, remember, that Russia has always intended to strike the West. They want to run their own new world order with them in control. We've got a temporary pact with China to join with them to control the world, and they'll have to fight it out, whatever. And they haven't gone that far down the road. But the goal is to take down the hegemony of the West. And but they're not ready to do that yet. So what I'm saying is it's very important to understand that in the status quo that was going on before, last Friday and before, was that the pro-Western Western Ukrainians were the beleaguered ones, and Russia was the bad guys. That's all the news kept saying. Russia has ironclad control of Ukraine, and the Westerners want to be free. The Russians are the bad guys. Now it's been reversed. And this is why this really plays to Russia's favor. Because if they want to postpone the eventual taking back of the Soviet states, whether it's Czechoslovakia, Poland, Ukraine, Georgia, etc., instead of playing like they're independent, if they want to take them back with force someday, they got to wait till they're militarily ready to take on the West, and they're not. So we've got several years that they've got to bide their time. So, but in order to do that, you've got to play the same game that Hitler played by attacking his own people, the Germans, in Poland and in Czechoslovakia, in order to justify that intrusion. It's too early for that justification. Everybody keeps thinking Russia's going to attack Ukraine right now to take it back, and it's too early. It's going to make Russia look very, very bad. They want more disarmament with the West. The West wants more unilateral disarmament with Russia to make sure that they pave the way for this war. And so what they've got to do is slow the process down. Now what happened? After Saturday's phony coup, now the Eastern Russians are the beleaguered people. And it's the Western Ukraine that's going to be the bad guys. That's why they had to have all of the pro-Russian majority in the Rada, in the parliament, resign, so that now it can be a majority of pro-Western people. They can get the blame for everything. Plus the fact this allows the West to come to the rescue of Ukraine's bankruptcy. I mean, Ukraine is literally bankruptcy. They instituted currency controls today. The West, just like in the former Soviet Union, they're going to take over all of the payments and give bailout money to them. Russians are loving this. But the most important thing to remember now is that from now on in advance, the Western, the phony opposition, these are run by Russians, but they're going to be claiming to be pro-EU. They're going to get the blame for everything that happens now. You're not going to see Eastern Ukraine and the Crimea secede. You're not going to see independence. And here's why. If they were to become independent, these majoritarian Russian populations in Eastern Ukraine and Crimea, everybody would be happy. The Western Ukrainians would be happy, and so would the Easterns, and you wouldn't have conflict anymore. What you're going to see is Russia's going to accept some type of federalization, which means that they're going to be federalized under a Ukrainian nation, but that means that the eastern portions will always be able to complain in the future about being underrepresented and oppressed by the dominant Western government. And eventually they can tweak that with protesters and with ongoing unrest so that in a couple of years, maybe 3 or 4 years, when they do want to take back Ukraine, they'll have the justification to do that. So do you see what I'm saying? You're going to have a much better permanent system of conflict by allowing Western Ukraine to go in, ostensibly to go into Western hands, when in fact it is Russian puppets playing as if they're in Western hands.
I want to come back and talk about Georgia and then take phone calls on the waterfront about strategy of the globalists, where you see that going. Michael wants to ask you about U.S. flags being banned in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals if the illegals find them offensive. Ray wants to ask you some other questions. Folks want to ask about smart tech and all the surveillance grid, the NSA. So Joel Skousen of worldaffairsbrief.com is our guest. I'm Alex Jones of Infowars.com on this live Friday edition. But going back to Joel Skousen, Joel, so what is the larger, let's spend 10 minutes then go to calls, on the 3 power blocks. Undoubtedly the globalists in their own documents say that is the power blocks. You're very accurate in that research. So what are the power blocks up to? What does this Ukraine thing mean? When will Russia be ready for the strike? Will they strike us with China? And go, but start off with Georgia, because from what I looked at, that was a real attack. What was that about?
Well, that was the West in combination with Israel, because, what the West does to have plausible deniability about directly giving military arms to something to exacerbate the Russian and former Soviet state situation. They used Israel. Israel, a lot of Americans don't realize that they use Israel to send a lot of military technology to China, which is going to be our number one enemy someday, even more, greater than Russia. And people would be incensed if they knew that Israel had a green light to transfer technology to China. But they also did it to Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These are the two semi-autonomous regions of Georgia that wanted to defect and become independent. And of course, the West normally does, like to encourage independence, but really they knew that Russia wasn't going to let that happen, and they did that to simply tweak Russia. Russia did, in fact, have to use military power to come in because of the fact that they had Israeli advisors in there. It looked to them like they were really trying to use military force to break away. This is entirely different than what happened in the Ukraine. Remember, the opposition has no military forces, none whatsoever, maybe only a handful of hunting rifles. There's no way that they could have done a coup, and that's why Russia has no reason to come in and to do a military, invasion to retake Ukraine. So
you're saying just like Arab Spring, the West knows the rebellion's coming, Russia knows it's coming, so they pre-trigger it so they can then control it, discredit it later.
And even worse, the prime minister today is saying he's accusing Russia of trying to invade Ukraine based upon the same phony information that I just told your audience about in Crimea. This is not Russian troops coming in from outside Crimea. These are Russian troops already in Crimea by prior agreement with Ukraine. They're simply shuffling some forces around to make sure that all the military bases are protected. Now, I'm not defending Russia, but they're tweaking the nose of the West, and the new Ukrainian government is tweaking the nose of Russia. But this is all political theater. Nothing is going to happen in a major military way. This is just the onset of continual conflict. And getting back to the bigger picture here, it's my estimation, based upon what I've studied about Russian rearmament and China rearmament, or actual armament. They aren't rearming, but engaged in massive armament, especially of missile forces. They still aren't going to be ready until at least 2020. And even though they're ready, that doesn't mean that there's going to be a strike in 2020. It's going to be sometime in the next decade, not before. Now, as you get closer to the point when they're ready, if they see an opportunity, it's possible that they could strike earlier than that. So I'm not trying to say that there's a definitive time that anyone, we're talking about three different multiple conspiracies here. There's no way anyone can say this is going to happen on a certain date. But we can tell when, by their own statements, they feel like they're going to be ready with their newest weapon systems. And everything out of the Russian system and the Chinese talks about post-2020 in terms of being ready with new aircraft carriers, with new submarines, with their new missile systems. And all the while, of course, the U.S. is disarming. We haven't built a new missile in 20 years, and we're shooting off what Minuteman III missiles we have and not replacing them. It's an incredible suicidal mission of the West to try to set the stage. And what they have to do, remember, they have to induce Russia and China to strike. As strong as they are getting, they still have, especially Russia, has a lot of decrepit systems, a lot of older systems. They got quantity. They don't have a lot of quality except in their newest systems, and they're very low in quantity of those things. But the globalists continue to have to disarm to induce them to strike. And the big picture I want to put out is, and people don't understand, why is it the globalists would want to bring on a nuclear strike onto America? And it's because you can't get Americans to give up essential freedoms, national sovereignty, and yield to a global government unless the U.S. military gets taken down. If they let the U.S. military get taken down in a preemptive nuclear strike, then they can come out of their bunkers, and our leaders are building huge underground bunkers because they know this strike is coming. If they come out of their bunkers and say, oh, the Russians and Chinese deceived us, we didn't know this was going to happen. But our only salvation now is to join together with NATO and other forces and form a new world government to prosecute this war. And literally everyone will lay down and say, save us, do whatever it takes. We don't care about sovereignty, just do what it takes. That's why this is going to happen. But they do have secret weapon systems. I believe they have space-based weapon systems that are going to be used to stop any further strikes while the West regroups and pulls out a lot of secret military weapons that they've been developing, not to defend us with, but to prosecute this war afterwards. I'm projecting that Russia will be defeated eventually in that war because the West will cut a deal with China to betray Russia and turn on its rear, and Russia can't win. And here's the advantage for China in that. He gets to eliminate the other third leg of the conspiracy for the New World Order, and then it's only China versus the West. And then the West wants that. They want a reinvigorated China. They'll use, just like we invigorated Russia during World War II by giving them all that aid and lend-lease, we'll do the same with China. Because the West wanted the Cold War. They wanted this great enemy because it would justify so much more militarization. And the globalists will want an enemy, a Cold War enemy after World War III to justify keeping all of the militarized troops of the world government.
And by the way, these same elites stirred up World War I and World War II, and in so many of their writings, they say they need something bigger than a regional war. Rand Corporation and others have said in the last 3 years they need a World War III to get the Anglo-American world government in place. So, I mean,
and to keep it militarized, Alex, to keep it militarized, they need a war big enough that they've got an enemy on the other side. You can't win it all. That's why they sabotaged and didn't let us win against Russia. In fact, we let Russia.
Sure, that's why they didn't let Patton go in and beat Stalin or MacArthur, because they wanted to keep him there.
That's right. So we're going to have, after World War III, a powerful world government with a global military and a global taxation system, a new currency. Remember, you can't have a collapse of the dollar and a new currency unless you have a world government to manage it. They're certainly not going to let, if the dollar collapsed, they wouldn't let the Fed reconstitute a new currency. And the Fed isn't going to let control of world finance. That's why I keep saying there's not going to be an economic collapse until this war comes. And that gives the powers that be cover. It's not their fault then if the economy collapses, because war did it.
Oh, it's clear. Notice they staged 9/11 right as the .com went under.
Exactly.
I mean, they're always pulling stuff so they don't get the blame. Now, I want to go to phone calls, but let me be more domestic here. The constant attack on men, the constant attack on women in traditional roles, the attack on children, the feminization, all of this, what is the goal behind that? I mean, I've got my views on it. I don't think I've ever asked you your views, Joel Skousen, about the war on men, because it is really kicking into high gear right now.
Well, this goes back to what we've talked about before, that at the bottom, this is a satanic conspiracy. He's giving direction. This is a real person, just like God is real, fighting against God and all that is good. There's no globalist purpose, for emasculating manhood or destroying Western culture and other things other than the fact, or promoting homosexuality for that, unless you want to destroy the moral fiber of a nation. And that's why this multifaceted front that you've so eloquently described is really something that is satanic. And it isn't a uniform conspiracy in the sense that anyone involved is being dictated to. Just like God speaks to conscience, Satan's in there all the time as well. And you have innately liberal people, innately immoral people who get those little hints from conscience to go ahead and attack all that is good and to promote that which is evil and to emasculate masculinity and promote feminism and all of this. And they can do that without conspiracy, that is, of a human variety. Because the grandest conspiracy is the fact that Satan himself works a multifaceted front in people's minds, through organizations, through leadership, that he is allowed to get people into.
Sure, it's a spiritual sickness.
Yes, it is.
But it's so obvious now.
And it's not easy to overcome. Yes, repentance and returning to Jesus Christ is the answer, but we can't force those things. We can only do that by invitation and so that's why the battle is one of dividing society. And that's what I see coming up to this war, is more and more society is going to be divided between those that see that there's a conspiracy, that they control both political parties, those that have a moral foundation. And unfortunately, a lot of Christian churches are being suborned by becoming mainstream and not being and being afraid of being criticized for being extreme and radical. Pastor Chuck Baldwin has some marvelous writings about and criticisms about the mainstream Christian churches and how they're basically getting into the New World Order without.
They're taking government money and literally just spouting whatever the mainstream media says now.
Yeah.
I tell you, what's the time frame? Do you think 5 to 10 years till they try this World War III thing?
As I say, I don't think it's coming before 2020. Now, as you get closer to that, I mean, you can't hold me to that because they could take an opportunity to move forward. But I think we've still got a good 5 years to fight this battle.
And you're saying if we see North Korea start shelling Seoul, get out of major cities.
That's right, because that's going to be the trigger event of World War III. There has to be some reason why they treat North Korea with kid gloves, that they don't ever have a military option for taking them down, a regime change. They know North Korea is going to be the trigger to start it. We may have to use tactical nuclear weapons to stop that kind of attack, and that will justify China and Russia for initiating a nuclear preemptive strike because we started with tactical nuclear weapons.
And they have the PDDs in place where the sub-commanders and silo commanders can't fire back. They'll be totally destroyed.
That's right. Our sub and missile commanders believe that they're going to be given the orders to launch on warning when Russia and China launch against us. But I don't believe those orders are ever going to arrive.
And for those that don't know, until the PDDs got changed under Clinton and continued by Bush and Obama, if the missiles are tracking in, they have the authorization to defend. Now they've taken that away.
That's right. And they have told them in PDD 60, 1997, to prepare to retaliate after absorbing a nuclear first strike that don't depend on, they didn't actually tell them you're not going to be able to launch. They just said, don't depend on it. Structure your system so that you can retaliate after absorbing a nuclear first strike. And General Butch Neal of the Marine Corps said, retaliate with what? He was just incensed. And especially since in that same year, Clinton agreed with the Russians that we would keep 50% of our missile submarines in port, either in Kings Bay, Georgia, or Bangor, Washington, to make it easier for the Russians to target them because they were in port. I mean, this is just incredible, Alex.
Yep, and meanwhile, the media pushes 24/7 to demonize the Tea Party. That's the big threat, the Homeland Security says. Let's talk to Michael in Oregon. You want to talk about U.S. flags being banned? You're on the air with Joel Skousen. Go ahead.
Hey, Alex, Joel, it's a privilege, gentlemen. I got to tell you, Joel, what you say, it's overwhelming. I'm sitting here listening. It's overwhelming. I thank you for the insight that you give us. My son today and I were talking about the USA flags being banned on T-shirts in California. And my son, who's 12, Connor, he said to me, Dad, that's just stupid. Out of the mouth of babes comes wisdom. And I thought I would ask you your take on that. I ordered a bunch of shirts, by the way. I'm going to pass them out, nice Texas shirts and USA shirts. But I think it's crazy. What do you think about it?
Well, California, like New York, is one of those vanguard states of the left, of the globalists who are testing the waters on everything. They're pushing the envelope and just banning patriotism, banning Americanism, banning American culture, just par for the course for the kind of government that you have in California. As a fellow Oregonian, I'll tell you, I wince at the Oregonian newspaper and, the liberal elite in Portland and Eugene. I expect them to follow suit pretty soon, too. What California does, Oregon does, a few years later.
And they're very proud of their anti-maleness. I'm seeing in the news now that it's offensive. Heterosexual couples, marriages, now see marriage itself as offensive. This isn't tolerance. We're being conquered by this. It's amazing. All right, thank you, caller. Yeah, who would ever thought American flags banned because the illegals are offended by them? Only in America, the former America. Ray in Illinois, he says he's a city council member. He wants to know what's next for the USA. Go ahead, Ray.
Hi, Alex. Hi, Joel. I've been a council member here for the past 3 years, and I actually got involved into doing this because of Alex and people like Alex and George and a few other like-minded people. And I want to say thank you for getting me involved, and I just hope that other people will get off the couch and instead of just complaining about what's going on, get involved some way or somehow. But, Joel, my question is, you talked about the timetable, what would happen? How significantly would that timetable go forward if an EMP pulse or a solar flare would hit North America, like they've been talking about, and wiping out our grid and our defenses going down? Would China and Russia say, "Hey, let's do it now instead of waiting," or what do you think about that?
Well, that's a scenario that's been prognosticated by several people. Here's why I don't believe that an EMP will ever strike separate from an actual physical nuclear strike. The one thing an EMP doesn't do, and let me just tell you about the technology of an EMP. The latest data from the U.S. government and others is that it takes about 6 high-altitude nuclear weapons to blanket the whole U.S. to take down the whole grid in a very serious way, not just one. And so there's been a lot of hype about Iran sending a whole fleet of ships over towards our coast and that they're going to launch a missile off that. Just not technically very feasible to do that. It takes more than one missile. And even if it did happen, an EMP strike doesn't take out the military because it's been hardened. And so the military would know where it came from. They'd be able to retaliate so it doesn't achieve the purposes of either Russia and China or even a rogue state, as if Iran would do that, which I don't believe they would. And so...
Sure, if they're going to do that, just smuggle a nuke into Manhattan and detonate it.
That's right. I mean, if you want to just make a show and get your country retaliated against, I mean, if you want to do something suicidal, there are easier ways to do that than to try to do it with a missile on a ship coming into. But I just don't think that's going to happen. It really is more technical than people think to throw a high-altitude nuclear weapon up there, and it's got to be...
Well, in the 60s, the Pentagon detonated big hydrogen bombs in the atmosphere, and it did knock out power, but they found it was sporadic through the atmosphere.
That's right. It is sporadic. It takes about 6 to blanket the whole U.S., and even then, as I say, it doesn't take down the military because they're hardened.
Now, a sun EMP could actually hit the whole country, the equivalent of big flare. Why is there so much military-industrial complex hype? We get hit by guests constantly wanting to come on about EMP.
Well, I don't know. Government agents have been hyping a lot of things, and frankly, Alex, anybody who calls up, me included, and says, I'm an insider in government and I have some top secret information for you, I don't take it. Because nobody in today's NSA can get away with talking to anybody on our side without getting caught. And if they can do it week after week, it's permitted. It's not that they're really on our side.
Sure.
They're always giving...
What do you think about Snowden?
I think Snowden was legit. He doesn't match that same thing. He's told, here's the information, it's out. He's not claiming to be in the inside anymore. He's not claiming to have insider information. And he reads true and legit to me.
That's what I think. Do 5 more minutes. I know you got to go. I want to come back and finish up talking about that source situation. We'll be right back. I agree with Joel Skousen that if you're getting real info from the government, even 15 years ago, I would have high-level tech company people, telecom people, and at one time somebody connected to the NSA, they would come to a live event where I was speaking, signing books, videos, or at a movie theater or a bookstore, and would walk out, leave something on my car, or hand me something at a rodeo or a car show where I was doing a remote. And I was given NSA stuff. I was given documents. I was given stuff about Delta Force in South Texas, and then talked to the San Antonio police chief who they tried to bribe. So there are cases where whistleblowers speak out, but usually it's public to the Associated Press. The police chief, after I interviewed him, went public to the Associated Press. L.A. Philippus about the military buying off the city for covert operations, and Thomas Sanchez of Kingsville. I've also been sent stuff by state police. I've been sent stuff by federal marshals. But it comes in unmarked mail, and then later I get a contact about it, and they get hopping mad. I got a call about the missing nukes, and I'm not going to say from who, but it was people that didn't know there were nukes hidden at Daesh, were freaked out and got concerned. So there are, but then they never would talk to me after. And I can't say any more to let out who it is, but a big thing happened over that. Enough for me to fear for my life. So I want to be clear, though. There are real whistleblowers, but somebody that constantly says, I'm a government agent, here, I'll give you this, I'll give you that, over the phone, over email, that's not real, because real stuff, it's when people are not going to be part of evil anymore. They blow the whistle like Snowden at great risk of themselves. Do you agree with what I just said, Joel?
And they get out. That's right. There's no way to stay a whistleblower and not get caught when you're inside government.
Well, I mean, I don't want to actually prohibit whistleblowers, but they found out who the state police guy was. And then we tried to fire him. He was senior. And, I mean, I can say that because people know who it is on the inside. And then he was able to keep his job and basically get put on a desk for sending me that info.
Right. By the way, before we go on, I want to congratulate you, Alex, on outlasting Piers Morgan. You're still here and he's gone.
Well, not by any work of my own, but by God's good graces. But yeah, Piers Morgan, though, it shows the mindset of the globalists thinking that that would ever be popular.
Well, Americans just don't like somebody looking down their nose at them and being disgusted with our Second Amendment rights.
But see, there's a lot of good stuff happening. I see a lot of people but like you said, it's either people are waking up or they're getting more into the darkness. I just don't know. It's going to get crazy.
Yeah, there's a great division taking place within our society. And, you know, the one hopeful thing I want to say about my scenario about this war coming in World War III, the hidden blessing of that comes through any war, even though there's a great deal of horror and terror in war, is that a separation of society happens and the good become better and the worst become worse and a lot of them die. And what's the best thing, though, is that the Lord will drive people out of the major corrupt metropolitan areas. There won't be any jobs left to hold them there. And I think he'll inspire them to relocate to places where they'll have more liberty, and then we can reconstitute liberty on a more regional and local basis, even though I don't think we're ever going to win it back on the national scene because of the power of this secret combination of power that we're dealing with.
Well, undoubtedly, they are animated by a spirit of evil and deception.